To the fans of Warner Brothers films, I will enjoy revising one film every day until you buy more UHDs. If you agree, buy the Dirty Harry UHD, and I will set up a meeting. If I do not see purchases, it will be my next pleasure to kill a classic title or an animated feature. Warner Studio label. What goes on in their minds? Studio kooks? Where the hell does he expect me to find an extra $40? You're not thinking of paying him, are you, Mr. Mayor? The City of Film Geeks does not pay studio criminals not to commit crimes. Instead, we don't pay a review department. Chief, who's in charge of this case? Inspector Crusader. He's waiting outside. Send Inspector Crusader in. Mr. Mayor, Inspector Crusader. All right, let's have it. Have what? Your report. What have you been doing? Well, for the past 3/4 of an hour, I've been piling up more research to do. Damn it all, DFIC. That's the mayor you're talking to. Won't you sit down, Inspector Crusader? There's a studio madman mastering loose. I've asked you what's being done. Fair enough. I'm checking identification files. Checking on all known past releases, audio remixes, transfer issues. We've arranged for transfer surveillance and 4K patrols, especially around the HDR10 and bad encodes in the UHD area. Video Ballistics is checking on the encode. We're pretty sure it's a BD100. We're running a computer check on every title in the files whose release date falls between 1930 and 2025. Why? Most of the Warner-held library. Thank you, Inspector. All right, pre-order the UHD. We'll agree to pay, but we need time to get the money together. Wait a minute. Do I get this right? You're gonna play this label's game? It'll get us more breathing space. It might get some films killed. Why don't you let me review this son of a disc? None of that. We'd end up with a real video bloodbath. I agree with the chief. We'll do it this way, all right? Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Come on, Crusader, let's go. Crusader? Sir? I don't want any more trouble like you had on the Fleischer Superman Blu-ray. Understand? That's my policy. Yeah, well, when a studio master is chasing a film with intent to commit revisionism, I review the bastard. That's my policy. Intent? How did you establish that? A revised master is chasing a transfer through a slipshot disc release with a DNR pass and audio processing. I figure it isn't out collecting for the National Film Registry. I think he's got a point. Inspector Crusader. Usual. So, the usual coffee lunch or the usual coffee dinner? Well, what difference does it make? Not much. Hey, is that DVD still parked across in front of the film vault? DVD? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Warner DVD. Case open? I don't know. How can I tell? Recycle logo cut into the plastic of the eco case. Oh, that's awful. Look at that flimsy case. Yeah. Do me a favor, will you? Call this telephone number. Forum Police Department? Yeah. Tell them Inspector Crusader thinks there's a 4K in progress at the bank. Got it? 4K. Got it. Be sure and tell them it's in progress, right? In progress. Yes, sir. Now if they'll just wait until the video cavalry arrives. Oh, Atmos remix. I know what you're thinking. Did he fire 6 review shots or only 5? Well, to tell you the truth, in all this excitement, I kinda lost track myself. But being this is a dedicated reviewer, the most powerful inspection force in the world, and would blow your revisionist disc clean off, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk disc? Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. In this video, I'll be reviewing and discussing the Warner UHD of the classic masterpiece Dirty Harry, directed by Don Siegel, starring Clint Eastwood, released in 1971. The first of what became the Dirty Harry series really needs no introduction and is even in the Library of Congress National Film Registry for good reason. It is an iconic and unbelievably influential film that's also a very tough and multifaceted film that's been analyzed and discussed to death for various reasons, but not always, I think, with a realization of what the film was really after, which is to ask questions of the audience and to be a true film of the 1970s in the way that people like to think of them, as being tough and gritty and about real issues and being the antithesis of what you expect from the studio system and breaking new ground. Dirty Harry is very much one of the core masterpiece films of 1971 and is really working on a lot of the same themes that are in The French Connection, especially with the lead Papa Doyle character and the Gene Hackman performance of, how far is too far for a dedicated cop who has no life outside of the job. Well, you could apply all of those things in describing Dirty Harry, but Dirty Harry as a film goes in a different direction and allows the audience to read into things and to make their own judgments. It's very much presenting a question of morals and ethics as really an examination of where society was at that point in time, and thus, depending on what you bring to the film, you have a completely different viewpoint, which is why the critical response was so split and very definite in the aftermath of the film's original release. I think the film's reputation has unfortunately been watered down by the sequels that it spawned, none of which match the power or the daring qualities of the original film. I think the sequels are, fine films on their own, but of those, only the first sequel, Magnum Force, had any feeling of the original film's attempts to try and ask the audience those daring sorts of questions. And I think that's because John Milius was still involved in that film and its writing to some degree. And that's something else you have to look at, is that Dirty Harry had a very long and fascinating production history. It started as a script about a cop in New York, essentially trying to nail a mad sniper, and it was all about the concept of how far is too far and playing around with those ideas. And you can also make the direct parallels due to the simple nature of the story that it can be seen as a modern-day Western. Essentially that it could have been a Western that was then transposed to modern-day 1971. And I think had the story been done as a Western, I think people would have been able to perhaps swallow some of what the film was getting after a bit more easily, because it's always easier to talk about real world topics and societal issues of the time in genre fiction or other genres. That's why so many of the great films about social issues were Westerns or science fiction films, because it was easier to get away, especially during the production code and the studio era. It was easier to get away with talking about real world topics if you disguise them in something else where you can then talk about them freely. And I think that's something you feel in Dirty Harry, even if you don't quite put your finger on it, that this is something that could have happened in the Old West, and it's still happening today. And it's still the question of, if it's a law official, how far is too far? Do the ends ever justify the means? And what makes the film great is that it doesn't try to answer those. It presents the predicament and the various situations, and it allows the pressure levels to build and also show where the characters are going. The production history of the film then continued with various rewrites that eventually transposed the film to California and saw a variety of famous names actually take approaches, most famously John Milius, whose work is still somewhat in the film, and he would go on to also work on Magnum Force. But even Terrence Malick wrote drafts of Dirty Harry, and eventually it was announced to be a vehicle for Frank Sinatra. So this was to be a older, grizzled cop who was on the edge, and it was a radically different sort of starting points to the Dirty Harry of the film we know. But there were even trade ads and poster mock-ups made with Sinatra looking very ragged in a trench coat and Sinatra as Dirty Harry. But eventually Sinatra dropped out, and the real masterstroke was in getting the film to Don Siegel, and that was really with the involvement of Clint Eastwood, because they had a great working relationship and had worked together several times. I think Don Siegel is what makes this film a masterpiece and what makes it truly great. He is one of the great underrated American directors, and his style was never to be flashy, but to always serve the material, and he had a particular penchant for realism and even dashes of humor in telling gritty crime stories or stories about real people and real situations and even getting out there on the streets on location. There are several really important films, I think, to understand as sort of precursors to Dirty Harry, several of them being Don Siegel films, and of course one actually starring Clint Eastwood. But I think you have to go back to 1952's The Sniper, which is the great Edward Dmytryk directed noir about an unfortunate man who feels this compulsion to kill and does so in San Francisco with a sniper's rifle. And it's the job of the city government and law enforcement officials to try and find this sniper and stop him before he kills again. And you also get to see the inner workings of the different departments and how not everyone agrees, and the police feel sort of handcuffed in ways and how they can't act in the way they want to. And when you see this film, especially since it uses a lot of location photography, you get the sense that it's working with a lot of the same themes as Dirty Harry. Obviously, nowhere near as dark and gritty, but it's got a lot of the same DNA. The next film is Don Siegel's classic noir, The Lineup, which is one of the great San Francisco films due to its incredible location photography throughout and its attempt to give not just a procedural feel to the police trying to obtain and nab members of a criminal organization while not knowing exactly what they're up to or where they are in the city. But it's also got some of the style and the feel of what makes Dirty Harry so unique and so special. The sort of detached, cool, observational style with flashes of humor. It's commenting on the action, but you can never put your finger exactly how it's commenting. It's always very cerebral and intelligent commentary. It's never hitting you over the head. And when you see The Lineup, it's impossible to not make the connections with Dirty Harry. It's essentially Don Siegel getting to shoot a gritty crime film in San Francisco on location in the late 1950s, and with police detective characters and extraordinarily larger-than-life villain characters, especially the Eli Wallach performance, which is one of the great villain performances in all of cinema, just as the Andy Robinson performance as Scorpio in Dirty Harry is one of the great villain performances in all of cinema. So if you see The Lineup, I think you can see the genesis of a lot of what Siegel would do in terms of how he shot and staged Dirty Harry. And I think it was Siegel sort of instinctively returning to that flavor, whether it was intended or not. The other film would, of course, be Coogan's Bluff, which Siegel made with Eastwood, and is Eastwood as a lone individual police officer who's sort of a fish out of water. It's got a different tone to Dirty Harry, of course, but I think that film has a great influence on not just their working relationship, but shows where they would move to in Dirty Harry. So I think without Coogan's Bluff, I don't think Dirty Harry would be as strong as it is. And then the other film would be the Peter Bogdanovich classic Targets, which is, of course, about a young man who feels the compulsion to kill people via a sniper rifle in Los Angeles, and also is a wonderful later film for Boris Karloff. But that film was also dealing with some of the same themes that would turn up in Dirty Harry and was released a few years before. Last would be the 1968 classic masterpiece Bullitt, which is the other great, most iconic San Francisco film, and that, due to the way that Peter Yates directed the film, has this incredible moody edge that even reverberates through its color photography in terms of how the sunlit streets start to infiltrate and infuse into this incredible moodiness, and how the film plays. Steve McQueen is iconic as Frank Bullitt, even though he doesn't say all that much. The film has a very British or European style to it, as Yates was hired to do the film because McQueen was impressed with his great film Robbery. But San Francisco had never been as wonderfully evocative on film before, and Dirty Harry is really, I think, the only film that tries to match that and is able to answer it in its own particular way. And I think knowing each of the films I've just highlighted helps you to understand exactly what Dirty Harry was building from and developing from as a film, because a lot of people seem to think that Dirty Harry is a complete original and there's not any other film like it, which that's not exactly true. It is an iconic film. There's nothing quite like Dirty Harry itself, but there are some important film precedents, including several Don Siegel films, that are important to understand what was the background of Dirty Harry as a film. The plot is, of course, the mad killer Scorpio, played by Andy Robinson, is on a killing spree in San Francisco and is challenging the authorities to stop him, very much inspired by the real-life Zodiac killings and other real-life events. So there is that sort of ripped from the headlines quality to add to the incredible and very visceral realism of the film. Detective Harry Callahan, played by Clint Eastwood, is the even famous within the department lone wolf character who is at times accused of being judge, jury, and executioner. He is so dedicated to the job that it's quite possible he's lost the sense of objectivity that any officer is supposed to have. But it's clear from the outset that he's been through so much and been worn down by his experiences that if he stopped to think about it, he really doesn't have anything left of himself. And he carries this sort of disgust, but it's a disgust not just at the world he's in, but also a disgust at himself. And both of these characters have certain linkages. There's a sense of duality between the two and how their actions actually reflect one another. And this seems like a very conscious decision made by all the screenwriters, and something Don Siegel obviously picked up on. It's a film that has a very straightforward narrative, but it's also incredibly focused and is thus able to allow the viewer to just immerse themselves into this world. And with the film being shot on practical locations in San Francisco with this incredible style, really building on what Bullitt had done a few years before, it's an experience of a film that still hits as hard today as it did in 1971, because it doesn't pull its punches, it doesn't offer up any answers, and it really makes the audience think. It makes the audience especially think about what would they do if put in that same situation, particularly in the moments where the Scorpio character has essentially advertised to the police that there is a victim he has and they will die at a certain point. And so there's a ticking time clock. So while I completely understand all of the political discourse that critics back then, and of course today as well, will always discuss with the film, which is important to do, I think a lot of that unfortunately detracts from what the film's ultimate message and goal is, which is to ask these sorts of hard questions about excessive force and how far is too far, and it misses that the film is making a statement by not giving clear-cut answers. It is the antithesis of the first Death Wish film, which has some similar concepts but doesn't properly set up or execute them, and so that film is never as strong or as good as it should be. And I think that film should have more of the discussion about its politics and what it ultimately is saying, rather than Dirty Harry, which does make a clear and valid point. It's challenging the audience. If it hadn't have done that, if it had just been a cops and robbers story essentially at its core, and the detective goes over the edge and does finally directly confront the killer by essentially taking the law into his own hands, if it had just been about that, then I think all of the discourse about its themes would have been much more justified, because that's unfortunately typically all anybody seems to want to talk about in terms of the film. There's much less focus on just how impactful and great of a film it is. I do think it stands alongside the other masterpieces of 1971, The French Connection, Straw Dogs, A Clockwork Orange, and especially Get Carter, among others, that were all breaking new ground within certain genres, having a grittier edge, using real-world practical locations, and daring to ask moral questions and deep-seated questions that everyone has if they stop and think about it, and having not just the wherewithal, but the intelligence and the commitment to these stories they were telling to not have answers or not have some easy solution that would then sort of wipe away everything the film had done up to that point, as a studio film would have. The sort of film precedents I talk about in terms of being influences on Dirty Harry, even those could only go so far. And I think the long production history of Dirty Harry and sort of looking at where the story was taken and how it was modified and then changed again and ultimately brought back to where the original writers had intended the character to go, in terms of sort of doing away with a lot of the rewrites and then the Sinatra versions and sort of trying to bring it back to the core story that the original writers had intended. I think that was the only way this film could be done. I think Dirty Harry is an absolute masterpiece because it dares to go to these dark places and ask truly hard-hitting questions that are uncomfortable. The film is uncomfortable on purpose in specific moments, and those are usually centered around violence. The chief one being the iconic confrontation in the football stadium where you have the supposed hero of the film shooting the target and then torturing him for information. That is an uncomfortable moment because it should be uncomfortable. If you see that and you don't find that uncomfortable, then you're missing the point of the film, because everything in terms of the staging, the direction, the design of that whole sequence is to punctuate the whole meaning of the film and to make the audience think. And this is further underlined by the iconic 44 Magnum speech, one of the great and most famous monologues of a character in all of cinema. And we have this twice. We have it at the start of the film and the shootout after the foiled bank robbery. This is also all about character and setting. It's not just to have an action beat, but it's to fully establish the Harry Callahan character, his viewpoint on the world, his inherent sense of wicked humor, and his own sort of internal judge and jury logic. But then we have that come back at the very end of the film in the final confrontation with Scorpio, and it's the dramatic highlight of the film and one of Clint Eastwood's best moments on screen, because the words are exactly the same, but everything the character has gone through over the course of the film has altered what those words actually mean. And at that point, Harry Callahan doesn't even necessarily know or believe in what he's saying anymore, because he's gone over the edge in different ways, not just with the police department, but with his own maybe last shred of moral code that he might have had. He's in uncharted territory. So at that point, that speech comes back about the 44 Magnum being the most powerful handgun in the world and it'll blow your head clean off. But the impact is enhanced dramatically because the audience knows what those words are and can see how it's not even working for the character anymore, and you don't quite know where the character is going to go. And the final grace note is the last shot of the film, which is the most important shot, and really makes you question why there were sequels to this film in the first place, because the film very much is an open and shut story that closes at the point exactly where it should, with the final shot of looking at the badge. It's also a film that rewards repeat watches immensely, because you can see how this film has influenced most of the cop and police procedural genre ever since. Its atmosphere and moodiness, though, is something that can never be replicated. And I don't think anybody besides Don Siegel could have been able to get that across and tell such a hard-hitting story and give you such a sense of San Francisco, not just as a place, but as a living and breathing entity that you can actually feel as if you're on the streets with the characters. Because Don Siegel had worked in San Francisco several times before, he knew the city. He had done location shoots there. He had this incredible background in crime films and cop films and noir, and of course started his career as an editor at Warner Brothers, which is the greatest training anybody could ever have in terms of knowing what makes a film tick. He was a master craftsman, but he was never flashy. And Dirty Harry in ways may be his most stylized film, but again, it's a very understated stylization, and it really brings up the churning emotions that are generated by the story growing increasingly tense and increasingly dark. And with the real world locations, this certain malaise, but also you feel the tiredness of the characters, how worn down they are, but also on top of that, there's this eeriness that creeps in, and it makes all of the sequences with Scorpio even more effective. And the film has some absolutely beautiful usage of handheld camera work sprinkled throughout, and a lot of nighttime shooting, which enhances the you are there visceral quality of the film. Another major element of Dirty Harry's impact and its atmosphere, besides Siegel's direction and Bruce Surtees's incredible color photography, is Lalo Schifrin's iconic score, which has just this wonderful mood to it from the opening title sequence onward. It really heightens the tension and the atmosphere of each scene, and is also really able to serve as a wonderful accompaniment to the two distinctly different lead characters of Harry Callahan and Scorpio, and also sort of highlight how they are in a lot of ways mirror images of one another. Scorpio is the completely unhinged reflection of what Dirty Harry could be. So Schifrin's score is so incredibly evocative that it's impossible to imagine the film without it. It's also a story that isn't afraid to take left turns and always stay grounded and focused, but not do the typical sort of expected narrative conceits. That's also enhanced by Scorpio as a character not being your typical mad killer on the loose. So Dirty Harry is building off of classic crime story elements in film. It has a number of notable precedents and is showing Don Siegel at his sort of later stage master craftsman era in terms of his directing style. You can read so much of his past work into Dirty Harry if you know Siegel's filmography, and it's impossible to see this film multiple times over the years and not marvel at the craftsmanship and how well put together it is and how concise it is, because it hits so hard and so quickly. That only increases the impact of the film. And so everyone's going to view it differently, especially because it asks such hard-hitting, unpleasant questions. But again, what makes it great is that it doesn't try to answer them, and it never tries to make the Harry Callahan a hero. He is not a heroic character. He is an anti-hero at best, and every audience member makes up their own mind about how they feel about the Harry Callahan character because they have to make up their mind about the film. They have to actually engage with it and react with it and to it. And it's a film that also grows over repeat viewings. I don't know if it's possible to really get the full impact with that first viewing because there's so much going on and there's such incredible cinematic technique that's invisible because it's all there to serve the story. And it's such a visceral and hard-hitting film that I think it really does require repeat viewings. And I can also understand the critical viewpoint that the film has a certain leaning and is perhaps encouraging people to take things too far. But again, I think that is actually missing the point. I think the film's strength and its greatness is that it presents these situations and it's showing what can happen and making the audience question how they feel about that, which again is something that Death Wish sort of purports to do, but really isn't doing. There's not the same sort of texture and layers in that film. And the reason why I link the two films is that they are dealing with a number of the same themes, and they both had a major critical backlash when they came out, and both were successful and became iconic and spawned a whole series of sequels that grew increasingly empty-headed and lackluster and pointless. And I also think the Dirty Harry films, in terms of the whole series, it's very much like the Rambo films, where First Blood was a great film that was actually about something and about character and about real world issues, and all of that got thrown out of the window in the sequels. So the Dirty Harry sequels are very much Your Mileage May Vary. They are all fine films in terms of how well they're made and produced. They do eventually get rather plain in the later sort of ones, but the intelligence of the original film, the daring qualities, daring to ask really tough questions and not give answers to an audience, the artistry of the technique, all of that is gone in the sequels. It's only Magnum Force, which was directed by Ted Post, where you get at least some of that. You can sense that that is a film that is picking up some of those elements where the first film left off. And then after that, there's no John Milius, and Michael Cimino also worked on the screenplay of Magnum Force, and he was not on the other films. So if you watch through the Dirty Harry series, you can see all of the elements that made the first film iconic and why it's in the National Film Registry. That gets very much dialed down in the first sequel, but at least there's some vestige of that there. And then starting with the third film, that's just completely gone. And then again, your mileage may vary. So now we turn to the film on video and how Warner has handled it on this UHD. To first talk about just how Dirty Harry's been a long time big seller for Warner on video. Going all the way back to the early days of physical media, it's been released on pretty much every format and never been given really the true deluxe treatment in terms of proper brand new transfer done as good as it could be with the original mono mix and a whole boatload of extras in a big deluxe package. It's usually been done as a standalone release with occasional transfer upgrades when new formats come around, and then also packaged with the other films as a series collection. It wasn't until the DVD era where they started doing special editions in terms of doing some extras and featurettes and things, and then with the Blu-ray they did a few more, and now with the UHD they've done some new pieces, but in Warner's typical style dropped others. But the audio has been a big problem for most of its physical media lifespan. Like Bullitt and a couple other Warner films, unfortunately, Dirty Harry has always been stereoized or remixed on its releases. It's only the very first initial home video releases that were not in the original aspect ratio and only had analog audio. So these are the very first VHS and beta releases and rental releases and the very first Laserdisc. Those were the only releases to have the original mono mix of the film. After this point, the film was stereoized, and Warner would basically make a fake stereo track. They did this for Dirty Harry and Bullitt at the same time, and so from that point onward, you only had fake stereo versions of the original mono mixes, and sometimes they might change things or massage them a little bit differently. So you were not getting the original audio of the film. You were getting some weird reprocessed version of it. But sometimes those stereoized versions can actually come in handy years later. And
actually be pretty good. So when Dirty Harry finally got remastered with a new transfer and for the first time got released in its original scope widescreen form, that was on the Laserdisc release in the early 90s, which first came out in this Dirty Harry collection box set. When they brought the whole series out at this point, every film but the Deadpool, which is the last film in the series, was a monofilm originally, just had a mono audio mix. Well, all of them were given new stereoized mixes, but really what Warner seems to have done is just spread the music cues and the overall ambience of the track out into a standard 2-channel stereo track, but these can actually be folded back down to mono pretty nicely. So they're essentially the kind of fake stereo that is just spreading the original mono mix around, and the transfers were quite good. So these still sound great and arguably could be considered the best sounding versions of the films on physical media, at least for all the films except the Deadpool, and most of all for Dirty Harry itself. And then after this point, the film would get released on DVD and eventually got the infamous 5.1 remix that changed and replaced pretty much all the sound effects, and most of all replaced the iconic Magnum gunshot sound effect of Dirty Harry's favorite 44 Magnum. This has been one of the most discussed and most infamous changed sound effects because it is the signature sound effect not just of the character, but of the film and the entire series, so why would you mess with that? And to make matters worse, the original mono mix was not present in any form, so that's been a giant problem. When Warner eventually did a new transfer on Blu-ray, it was, of course, much better, but had some color timing inconsistencies, which were turning up in all Warner HD masters at the time. So it was several steps forward, but a couple steps backward. But the audio remix unfortunately remained, and there was still no original audio. So you had to resort to having the old Laserdisc and its stereoized version of the mono, or going back to the original pan and scan analog releases, which were of limited quality because they were just old analog tracks and you had to deal with degradation and wear on those old copies. So that brings us to the UHD, which was a new high-resolution scan of the original negative and done in the standard Warner releasing style, where they dump an iconic catalog title in a generic standalone UHD with generic new artwork, and you have to hope for the best in terms of transfer quality and if it might include all the old extras, if it includes any extras at all. So to talk about the picture quality of this release, this is pretty much in keeping with what you expect from these Warner catalog UHD releases. This is a gigantic leap forward in terms of the picture quality, the overall color timing, and everything, because it's a modern high-resolution scan of the original negative, and on the surface it looks incredible and also shows the various issues in terms of the color timing and look of the old Blu-ray. But this is Warner, and you have to dig a bit deeper than that. And unfortunately, the problems are so glaring in this presentation that you can notice them right as the film starts because they're there in the opening freaking shot. The opening shot, I'm not kidding. And what you see in the opening shot is unfortunately the dreaded frozen grain effect. This is where the actual film grain of an image and sometimes noise in the image will actually lock into place due to how the transfer was done and how the mastering was done. Sometimes this is an after effect of over-aggressive digital noise removal or manipulation. But there are moments throughout where you have the entire grain field, particularly around objects or heads especially, when there's a clear, solid background, especially skies and outdoor shots or clear walls inside offices, such as the police department. But you'll actually see the grain of the image lock into place and move around with objects or various things moving. That's when it's at its most obvious. Now, here in the Dirty Harry transfer, the frozen grain is inconsistent. You'll see it pop up here and there, but it doesn't run through the whole film like, say, the terrible Dr. No UHD, where it ran through the whole film. But there, and in most cases, the frozen grain examples are minor. They're so small that it's understandable that most people wouldn't see them. But here, when they do happen, they're so massive that it's basically entire portions of the image. So the whole screen in terms of this section, like the whole middle or the side, or the opening shot on the gun barrel of Scorpio's sniper rifle is just completely surrounded, and you just see this big swath of frozen grain glob moving around. There are two moments that stuck out where it was probably at its absolute worst. One is when Harry's talking in the police station, and they go to get some of the crappy station coffee out of the coffee pot. Because the walls are sort of off-white, you will very clearly notice just how much frozen grain there is. But the worst shot in the film is actually a nighttime sequence, and I don't know how they managed to do this, but when Harry is jumped by the guys in the tunnel during the iconic sequence of Harry having to run from payphone to payphone to get the next tip to hopefully save the kidnapped victim's life, with Scorpio tormenting him all the way. Well, the scene where he goes to run through the tunnel and he gets jumped by the guys in the dark, that scene has some of the biggest and most obvious frozen grain examples I've ever seen in a transfer, and somehow they did this on a nighttime handheld scene. The screen is supposed to be almost completely black. You're not supposed to be able to see what's going on. That's what makes the scene so striking and eerie. But somehow they managed to freeze the grain so bad that you can just see it, just sort of thrashing around in these big sort of ugly, misshapen lumps everywhere, because you can just barely see the figures and faces in the darkness. So that's actually the worst example in the film, and it's really difficult, I thought, to make frozen grain happen in a nighttime scene, let alone a pitch black scene, but Warner managed to do it here. So the frozen grain is there right off the bat. It's in the opening shot of the film. It's inconsistent, thankfully, so it only rears its ugly frozen head here and there. But when it does, it's truly bad in terms of just how much the artifact is there and how large they are. Because again, it's not just, it's around a head here and there, and it's just a little tiny, that's why I always call them halos. Here it's like big giant swaths of the screen. It's really at the level of the worst example, which is the terrible Paramount UHD of The Godfather, and that was intentional due to the extensive grain removal and processing they did. And that seems to be an issue here on Dirty Harry, because there's also certain moments where the image does look certainly a bit smoothed over, or what is typically called grain managed. You'll notice that every once in a while, some of the faces, especially in close-ups or medium shots, look a little soft or less detailed, like they've been smoothed over a bit. It's, of course, impossible to know if this is true, but, when it's not consistent with the rest of the film and it sort of sticks out and it looks a little bit unnatural, and you've also got the gigantic frozen grain here and there, which is usually a side effect of overzealous grain management, then I can safely say that it does seem like there's been some grain management here and there. But again, just very selectively. It's very inconsistent, because otherwise the film looks stupendous in terms of the level of detail. The color timing in HDR is another particular issue. Color timing is, of course, subjective, and you can only get a sort of general idea of how a film might probably look. No one can claim to be, able to tell 100%, because it's not like you're able to look at a vintage preserved dye transfer Technicolor print that was properly made back in 1971. It's not like you can just go to a museum and look at something like that, although you should be able to, because it belongs in a museum. But you can get this sort of general idea if a film has moments that look off to what a 1971 film usually would look like, or if something's really out there compared to all the other iterations you've seen of a film. And so here, the color timing is a dramatic improvement over the old Blu-ray, which had some of the color timing and other visual tendencies of Warner HD masters at that time. Back then, they really had this penchant for pushing skin tones to be a little bit more orangey, and pushing the color in certain ways and the black levels in certain ways. So they had a particular look to them that affected a number of films around that time. The other one that always jumps to mind is the Blu-ray of the original Lethal Weapon film had sort of the same effect when that HD master released on that Blu-ray. And similarly, that UHD from a new scan no longer has that sort of color signature. So here on Dirty Harry, the color timing is a great improvement, but it's also inconsistent because there are shots sprinkled throughout the film in certain moments where it changes in between shots. There are moments where the skin tones especially do appear off. It's again inconsistent. It happens every once in a while, but there were moments that I noticed, and I've seen discussion that other people sort of picked up on this, that a lot of us are noticing moments where it seemed like there was a slight shift, and so certain shots were a bit off. I don't know if this might be linked to the original photography, maybe, because this was a negative scan, but either it's something in the original elements or it was something that was not properly addressed in this master, and I would lean more towards that given the other issues. Now, all of that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's also inconsistent. It obviously doesn't completely wreck the transfer, but all of them are unfortunate and none of them should be here, especially if you were doing a brand new ultra high resolution scan of the original camera negative of one of your most iconic films in your library, but Warner does this all the time. The other gigantic issue, and this is probably the biggest one overall, is unfortunately the HDR presentation. Warner does not do Dolby Vision on UHDs because they don't care about quality and don't want to pay the licensing fee, unfortunately. So their UHDs are always HDR10 only, and their HDR grading of catalog films is all over the place, and unfortunately this is one of the worst they've ever done. It's not insanely bright like some of the worst offenders that get labeled the dreaded light canon like Sony used to do on their early UHDs before they sort of figured out how to do HDR on catalog titles. But since this is a film where it's practical locations and it's iconic for its views of San Francisco, especially during the daytime with the bright sunlight, if your HDR grading is, shall we say, too bright or even just a little bit bright, it's going to be an uncomfortable viewing experience because when you look at this UHD, as soon as the film starts, we're outside in the sunlight, and then we have Harry walking around during the main title sequence, and he's got his sunglasses on, and you want to say, "Hi, Harry, can I borrow your sunglasses? I need them to watch this transfer." So all of the exterior daylight scenes are too bright, some worse than others. It is a problem throughout the film, and the overall nit usage is much too high for a film of this vintage. I found this a very distracting and frustrating experience, and frankly, the HDR grade, like pretty much all Warner Studio UHD HDR10 grades, needs to be redone. It is not proper for a 1971 film, nor is it proper for Dirty Harry. It is better in areas, and of course the HDR does enhance the visuals and the strengths of this new transfer, but it also shows up the visual problems I have so far discussed much more. It highlights them, and you get the added not benefit at all of all the exterior daylight scenes frequently being too bright, especially when the sun is actually in the shot, or you've got reflections off of glass or metals or cars. So this transfer is a hot mess of typical Warner problems, but most of them are at a much more vivid and unfortunate level of how obvious they are. So as good as this new transfer is, again, it's not the transfer. It's, you know, the scan itself was great when they did it, except it's always how Warner handles stuff and how they cut corners. So why in the world they did a ultra high resolution scan of this film and then handled it in this way and cut all these corners and then threw it on a UHD with the usual cut corners? It kind of begs the question, well, why would you do this in the first place if you weren't going to do it right? Because then you have to look at the encode, which isn't great, and that's another typical Warner problem. They don't max their bit rates out. This frequently drops down to the 30s, 40s, and 50s in terms of megabits per second, averaging in the 70s or so. one would like to see an overall UHD bitrate be at least in the 80 to 90 megabits per second range, especially since the extras are not all that great, and the disk space would allow for a proper encoding job if Warner cared to do it. But Warner doesn't allocate their disks very well either, and so anytime they have any sort of extras on the UHD, that means the encode of the feature is going to be even worse than it would be had they just done one of their typical bare bones UHDs with no legacy extras. Again, the scan is great, but every once in a while there is a little bit of wear in terms of just the faintest bit of movement or maybe a tiny speck here or there that makes it through. So it's not a 100% pristine presentation either. It's pretty darn close, but there is still the occasional fleeting sign that this is still a film from 1971. But overall, I have to say that this 4K presentation, yes, it's the greatest quality we've ever had for the film on physical media. Yes, it's an unbelievably dramatic improvement over the Blu-ray, but it's got a ton of problems it should not have. Yes, they don't run throughout the entirety of the film, but when they do happen, the severity of them is massive, chiefly the frozen grain and the HDR. I could frankly live with the few moments of inconsistent looking color. I don't think there should have been any sort of grain management, but the couple of shots that look a little managed, shall we say, is something you see all the time in things. So those two elements are to be expected. But here we have all the hallmarks of a typical corner-cutting, uncaring Warner Studio label UHD. We have lesser encoding. We have bad HDR that's far too bright when it shouldn't be and ruins the experience and is not what the director and cinematographer ever intended. And then we have the horrible frozen grain examples that, while they are inconsistent, when they do happen, the severity level is so high it's some of the worst I've ever seen. All of these are unacceptable. None of these should have been here. And this makes this disc, while still essential for the overall presentation upgrade compared to what came before and fixing the issues of the Blu-ray, it makes it worse than the Blu-ray in other areas. So this is, many steps forward and several giant steps backward, and none of this should be present here, and so it makes it one of the worst Warner UHDs. That's also painfully still essential because it's an upgrade in so many areas. So it's a mixed review at best, but it's infuriating as heck, and none of this should be a thing, because why in the world would you go to the time and expense of doing an ultra high-res scan of one of the most iconic films in your library to finally give it a physical media presentation without some gigantic transfer or audio problem, and you still couldn't do the job right? I mean, how long have we been doing this? Since the dawn of physical media in the early 1980s, and they still can't be bothered to get it right. Yeah, I said it. I know I'm a nerd, but, if I don't say it, who's going to? Now we turn to the audio. The film has been remixed yet again, now with a Dolby Atmos remix, which is Warner's patented method of remixing films now. Either they take the pre-existing remix and bring it into Atmos and play around with it and make a remix, whether it was good or bad, even worse, or they do a new Atmos remix from scratch and go to crazy town doing whatever they want to do with a catalog film. Here, the track seems to be working from the 5.1 remix that was done for the Blu-ray, which itself was a modified version of the first 5.1 remix. Here, the gunshots are still all new and sound terrible, but Dirty Harry's Magnum gunshot sound effect is mostly here. So that was I guess, their sort of quiet concession to all the fan complaints. But this Atmos track should not be listened to. It is atrociously bad in terms of how it is not a 1971 sonic experience at all. The original mono mix is, of course, limited as being single channel and from 1971, but it's how they mixed the film originally. It's properly mixed and balanced for each and every scene. This Atmos remix tries to expand everything, and with all the new sound effects and gunshots and how the sound field is torn apart and just made into a modernized experience, it's loud, it's in your face, it has no subtlety, it has less dynamic range, and in the big iconic moments of action with gunshots and other sound effects going on, it's a mess and sounds so garish in comparison to the original experience. Take the opening bank robbery with the iconic 44 Magnum monologue. That is opened up and is all over the place, and it's a distraction, and it's garish. But probably the worst example is during the nighttime stakeout to try and catch Scorpio, and they're watching from an opposing rooftop. And then when they're noticed and Scorpio opens fire, and you've got all the machine gun blasts hitting the sign above them and causing the lights to spark and everything. That's a great moment, and it builds tension, and then it's got a great beat of action that's full of suspense. Well, if you watch it with the Atmos remix, especially combined with the horrible overbright HDR grading, it's just a mess. You can't follow the action anymore, and the sound is so over-aggressive, in your face, expanded to no longer reflect the actual geography of the scene and how it was staged and what you're supposed to be following with the visuals you're getting. That's probably the best example I have of why this Atmos remix is terrible. It does not reflect a 1971 film. It doesn't reflect the original mono mix. Yeah, all the dialogue's still there and everything, but this was somebody else coming in after the fact and doing what they thought was a modern, appropriate experience for a 1971 mono film. I don't know why this is done. I don't know why this is a thing. And frankly, I'm of the opinion that audio remixes, unless to fix a particular problem from the original production that's documented, or if they have the participation and cooperation of the original production team, whether it be director or sound designer or mixer. Outside of those specific cases, I'm of the opinion that audio remixes for catalog films are the audio equivalent of colorization, because they are. And this is a perfect example of that. And the reason you can actually understand that is that for the first time since the film's release on physical media all the way back in 1981-82, the original mono mix is actually on a release of Dirty Harry. That's really the number one reason why anybody should purchase this UHD, is that the mono mix is here, it's in a decent quality, it's a new transfer of the mono mix, and it's in a lossless codec. So you would think, oh wow, great, the mono mix is here, it's been restored, we finally got the original audio, so who cares what the remix does? Well, there's two problems with that, unfortunately. One, the disc, like pretty much all studio discs, will always default to the god-awful modernized remix, and so you have to manually select the original audio, and people who don't know about this stuff or just buy the disc or watch it on streaming, where it's going to always be the remix, now down mix to 2.0, they'll never know about the original audio and what they're missing, and what they're actually experiencing is someone else's decisions and choices being grafted onto the audio of a film. But the second problem is that this isn't necessarily the best presentation of the mono mix. When Warner started doing these inclusions of original audio on UHDs for films that had not had their original audio on releases for decades, it was a major surprise, because Warner Studio releases typically don't give a crap about original audio. This first happened on The Exorcist, and then North by Northwest, which hadn't had its original audio on a release since its 1997 VHS tape release. And now we have Dirty Harry as well getting its original mono mix back. But while it's a new transfer of the mono mix, it has been semi-restored, essentially. Its fidelity is good, but when you compare it to the old Laserdisc folded down to mono, the Laserdisc sounds fuller and more dynamic and more detailed throughout than the new mono transfer does. However, the new mono transfer has different EQ and seemingly some processing on it, and the argument could be made that when you compare the two directly, that the music sounds maybe a little bit more natural in that, because it's not the fake stereo track folded back down to mono. So there are trade-offs between the two, but the other thing, if you pay close attention, and this happens in a lot of these Warner restored mono tracks they throw on UHDs, there's occasionally some defects that have not been addressed. And on this track in particular, there's one line of dialogue that does have a word that's obscured by a blip or some damage. So you can actually identify spots where there is some wear and stuff that should have been addressed in a restoration of the audio track, but really what it seems like they're doing is just transferring what they pull from the vault and syncing it up to the film and maybe applying some EQ or noise reduction, and then that's just it. That's why we have defects that obscure dialogue in the Dirty Harry UHD and even ones on the North by Northwest UHD, and neither one is technically as good as the best pre-existing mono from the earlier days of home video. So if you want the best original mono presentation of Dirty Harry, you really have three options. You've got the new UHD version, which will satisfy most and is pretty good, but not perfect. You've got the arguably better sounding version using the fake stereo mix from the early 90s Laserdisc and folding that back down to mono. I think it is overall a better experience, and in spite of having to fold it back down, you're actually still getting the mono mix pretty much for the most part, except for the bigger music cues. And that, I think, is actually a better overall sounding mono than the UHD mono. But then you've also got the original actual mono transfer from the original Pan and Scan home video masters. So if you can track down one of those and get it in mint condition and then transfer it yourself, then you can compare that to the other two. So you've essentially got three versions of the mono. Thankfully, there is one on the UHD. It's solid. It's not where I would like it to be quality-wise, but it is one of the better of the modern Warner mono audio original track inclusions on a UHD. But I still think the early 90s Laserdisc folded back down to mono does actually sound better, and if you compare the two, I think it's impossible to not come away realizing that the fake stereo track folded back down to mono actually does sound better for most of the feature. So as always, the classic phrase comes to mind, Warner's gonna Warner, when you try to explain any of this or why there are these continual issues of corner cutting and obviously not taking the time to give it 100% in terms of care and effort and trying to get things right. You can only come back to the phrase, Warner's gonna Warner. In terms of the packaging and artwork, the standard release comes with a slipcase for the first printing, and then they do away with these and just sell the case itself with the same artwork. So this has the modern Warner style used on all their standard UHDs of focusing on the lead character and doing some super generic Photoshop mashup. And this is also reminiscent of the other Eastwood films they brought out on UHD at the same time, Outlaw Josie Wales and Pale Rider. So this is a very uninspired cover. It's not really offensive in terms of being, super generic and bad. The worst example is still the unbelievably god-awful cover that Warner or what seems like maybe an AI program did for their UHD Steelbook of Blazing Saddles by literally just having a floating saddle on fire. But Dirty Harry has such iconic imagery and iconic original posters that were actually used sometimes on various past physical media releases that this is just lackluster and so generic that the more you look at it, the more you just go, this is bad. It doesn't really suggest the film at all, and it makes it look more like a standard procedural or cop film. Only thing I can say is that it's at least alluding to the original poster concept with the sort of bullet hole through broken glass aesthetic, which has been sort of printed on as a sort of bare foreground element to this new generic image of Eastwood there. And then you've got the generic patrol car lights behind. So yeah, this just reeks of trying to create a generic thumbnail image for the film on streaming or something. But I will give them that, at least it's passable and somebody took an extra second to at least have some part of the original poster on there. But all they had to do was just take a section of the original poster that's been done before on physical media releases. It wouldn't have cost them anything, and it's so bold and striking and clearly shows that it's a Clint Eastwood starring film that that's all you need, and it would have been so much more effective than whatever the heck this is. Warner did kind of try to do this with their Steelbook version, which takes the aesthetics of the original poster in terms of a still of Eastwood as Dirty Harry, with the coloring being shades of orange, black, white, and a sort of off purple, almost pink. But here it's just a modern recreation of that using a different still, and it's looking at Harry from the side, so it's a side profile shot. It looks really weird. It doesn't work, and it's only on the Steelbook version. So again, it makes you wonder, why didn't they just use the main key artwork image from the original poster and just put that on the case itself and just be done? You know, that's all they had to do. Instead, somebody made this generic thing and then tried to make their own generic version of the original poster art instead of using the original main key art that everybody thinks of when they think of Dirty Harry, and would make anybody interested if they saw that image because it's such a great piece of graphic design. So, yeah, Warner does this a lot. They do UHD steelbooks as more limited collector items, and they will typically either manipulate original poster artwork or give you something somewhat like it, or a sort of modern attempt to distill elements of that instead of doing what they should have done in the first place and just using original art. So anyway, we have the typical generic Warner spine on the slipcase. And then we have the rear, which is admittedly nicely laid out, and the actual slipcover, as Warner likes to do, has the fancier printing with the slight reflective quality as well. Inside we have the case itself with the exact same artwork and the usual Warner style, so nothing fancy, and of course the printing is much less fancy than the slipcover, so that's the real reason why you want to get the slipcovers, that the art reproduction is better. Same spine, and same rear cover. And inside we just have the UHD disc with a plain black label, no other major identification, so it's as generic as possible, and that's in keeping with all these Warner UHDs. Also, like other Warner UHDs, there is no Blu-ray of the new master, so there's no remastered Blu-ray, and there's no Blu-ray inclusion whatsoever. There is a digital copy insert, so if you don't have UHD capability, you are unable to view the new restoration or 4K master, or the new additional supplements, of which there are 2. All the extras are on the UHD disc itself, so that does show at least some sign that Warner is trying to address some past mistakes and choices where they just did away with legacy extras entirely, or would just bundle in the old Blu-ray so people wouldn't complain that they didn't have all the extras. And now every once in a while, like here on Dirty Harry, they do some short new extras. They're not really worth the cost of admission or really worth anything, but at least it's something. But unfortunately that means the problems of the disc encoding are another issue, because the disc is having to share space with the legacy extras and other materials, and Warner's encoding is not great to begin with, and that means the feature is going to suffer more. It also means that the extras themselves will have various compression and other issues because they don't always do a great job of transferring the old files over. And it's probably more just a cost-cutting move because they don't want to keep including old Blu-ray discs in here, since that means you're obviously going to have to pay to include a second disc and a case that accommodates 2 discs. So they've settled on just shoving over most of the old legacy extras onto the new UHDs and just giving you a digital copy. So to talk about the supplemental features, this again has most, but unfortunately not everything from the old Blu-ray, and the quality does vary on these extras. To start with, we do have 2 new pieces. They're basically short featurettes, both under 10 minutes long. The first is Generations and Dirty Harry, which runs just over 6 minutes, and is a small collection of critics and other people, notably George George Feltenstein, head of the Warner Archive, just basically talking about the film, but it's very surface level. It's, again, only 6 minutes long. It doesn't really have anything of merit. It's basically just a little fluff piece if you've never seen the film before. There's no room for having a detailed discussion, so it's really superfluous and doesn't really matter. And the same people are interviewed for the second piece, so basically they just took the certain comments about one particular aspect and turned that into a second featurette, which is also very short. So neither one really gives you the proper context about the film's development, its long and fascinating production history, and especially it doesn't talk about the cinematic precedents in both Don Siegel's career and Clint Eastwood's career, but also films that worked in a lot of the same themes. And when they say things like, oh, there'd never been anything like Dirty Harry before, if you know anything about Don Siegel's other films, you're sitting there going, what about the lineup, you know? And then when they say, oh, a sniper in San Francisco, you know, there'd never been anything like that before, and you're like, what about The Sniper? About a sniper in San Francisco? I mean, I know it's hard to talk about films that aren't owned by the company, but you talk about them and then you can at least show an image of the poster. That's what you do in extras. You don't just act like this stuff didn't exist. I mean, again, I know there's not room to really go into detail, but if you're going to make an extra, actually make it worth something, because these aren't worth anything, and that's unfortunately what happens with all of these new Warner supplements that I've seen so far. They're not worth anything, and they're certainly not worth buying the UHD for. The other new extra is called Lensing Justice. This runs just under 8 minutes, and of the two, this is the one that's actually more worthwhile because it's focusing on Bruce Surtees' photography and Don Siegel's direction, and how the visuals of the film are so evocative that it helps to really put the audience into the world of the film. So this is actually about something that's very important and I think doesn't get highlighted enough. But again, because it's so short and it's the same people from the same interview sessions, it's just little tiny sound bites that unfortunately don't add up to a whole lot, but at least it's a little bit more worthy of your time and attention than the first piece was, which really is not worth your time. I will mention, though, that you'll see clips from this new 4K master in these pieces, which are 1080p SDR. And so that means the clips from the film are 1080p SDR. So you can actually see moments from this new 4K master without the HDR brightness issues that I talked about in the feature. So you can get these little tiny glimpses of what those certain moments would look like without certain elements being super bright for no reason. But also, for some strange reason, it looks like these were taken from an earlier version of the master, because you can actually see some damage in there that obviously means this is from an earlier file before that damage was addressed. And it also looks like it wasn't really converted to SDR very well, so take all this with a grain of salt, but it does give you a slightly different glimpse into versions and how this master was made, and it kind of begs the question, if you're going to have clips of your new 4K master in 1080p buried on the UHD in one of these featurettes, you know, you could have made a remastered 1080p Blu-ray if you wanted to, and obviously you didn't want to. But of course, it being Warner, they're not great at doing SDR down conversions from HDR. All you have to do is look at the terrible, defective remastered Blu-ray of The Matrix, which was just completely defective, and they never did anything about it. Instead, their solution was to just stop doing remastered Blu-rays, period. Warner's gonna Warner. We have the Richard Schickel audio commentary that was originally done for the DVD release. If you know anything about Richard Schickel's audio commentaries, you know they are a chore to get through, and especially on older classic films, he is very disparaging towards films and likes to question them and not really seem like he wants to be there or was really prepared to do the track. So all of his commentaries are really a struggle to listen to because he has long periods of silence. He likes to say and a lot. And here he's a bit more on point because, of course, he was the official biographer of Clint Eastwood and was working for Eastwood for a great number of years, so they had a strong personal connection. And when it's an Eastwood film or a film more accepted by the critical mindset as a great film, his commentaries are usually a little bit more listenable. So here he does talk some about the overall production history, but you would get a lot more out of just reading the film's Wikipedia page and doing research on your own. It's one of his better commentaries, but that's not saying very much because most of his commentaries, I think, rank among the worst audio commentaries of all time. And that's nothing against Schickel as a critic or a person or anything. That's just after years of struggling to listen to his commentaries. And I did listen to this again for this review, and it's one of his better ones simply because it's an Eastwood film and he has some more information at his fingertips. But if you listen to it once, you're not going to listen to it again, but at least it is here and present. But I think this release would have been much better had Warner actually commissioned a new commentary from a critic who actually did good commentaries, because this is not a good commentary. It's a Richard Schickel experience in terms of the commentary listening experience.
Schickel!
Everything else is legacy extras and various quality as they stem from different releases, some dating all the way back to the Laserdisc release in terms of the LD box set. First is the American Masters episode on Clint Eastwood, which runs about 90 minutes. There's a lot of famous faces who are interviewed, and it does give you a nice perspective on Eastwood's career and is at the overall quality level you would expect from an American Masters PBS episode. It is in standard definition and is framed at 1.78 to 1 or 16 by 9. I think originally it may have been 4:3 as this was done for television. The overall quality is fine, but it does look a little bit noisy, which is, to be expected as it's an old piece made for television, but Warner doesn't do the best job of how they encode and present legacy materials. And also, sometimes the frame rate looks a little bit weird in terms of some of the movement or some of the clips used. So the quality is not super great, but it's also at least present. Next is the Vintage Man from Malpaso documentary, which runs just under an hour. This is the vintage documentary that was on the Dirty Harry box set on Laserdisc and is a nice time capsule of Clint Eastwood interviews at that time in the early 90s and other vintage interviews of famous stars and other people who have worked with Eastwood. And of course, it's also sort of a promo piece for his Malpaso company and his productions at that time. So it's a nice time capsule, and it's lengthy enough to be worth a watch. Again, it is older, so it's 4:3 and upscaled standard definition. It's a very old video file, so it doesn't look super great here, and the encoding's not great. And it does look much better, obviously, on the original Laserdisc, where it also has lossless PCM audio. Ironically, though, I think this actually looks better in places than the American Masters documentary that was done much later, because that presentation or whatever file they used is quite noisy, whereas this one really isn't. But here there are even more frame rate issues, as there are points where it almost looks like the interviews are recorded over a Zoom call in terms of how there's sort of stagnation and some frame rate issues. That's not really on the Laserdisc or past versions of this. I just chalk that up to another example of Warner not encoding and presenting legacy extras well on UHDs. From the Blu-ray, we have some HD featurettes, the first being Fighting for Justice, which is another collection of interviews of very famous faces, including even Gene Hackman, talking about Dirty Harry and Eastwood and his filmography. So this is really worth it to hear some famous faces talking about the film and some bits bits of Eastwood talking about it himself later on, but otherwise it's not worth it except for just hearing their thoughts. The editing's trying to be a little flashy, but it is what it is. And you should also watch through the credits, as there are some outtakes with extra interview pieces, which do have some nice detail in them. So it's one you watch all the way through. We have the 30-minute piece called Dirty Harry the Original, which is a featurette hosted by Robert Urich, talking about the film, and rather oddly, it mixes the classic In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida by Iron Butterfly over clips of the Dirty Harry films to introduce this thing. But again, it's otherwise just a collection of interviews and Eastwood talking a little bit about the film, and you wish you could just watch the interviews by themselves in their entirety instead of being packaged this way, but that's what it is. The best and really only truly important extra is the vintage making of featurette Dirty Harry's Way, which is an HD transfer of the original film source, which is also priceless for showing not vintage clips of the film, but actual on-set footage of Don Siegel and Clint Eastwood and the entire production shooting sequences. You can actually see the process of certain scenes in the film being shot and staged and worked out, and you get that sort of fly-on-the-wall perspective. That's why it's priceless. It's otherwise the typical sort of under 10-minute featurette promo piece with some bits of voiceover narration and trying to hype up the studio's latest release. But these are absolutely priceless when they have unique material, especially actual footage of the production being shot, and that's why it's important to be here, and why it's great that the HD presentation is solid, and even though it's only 7 minutes, it's the one truly worthwhile extra on this disc. The two extras that are dropped from the original Blu-ray are another featurette called The Long Shadow of Dirty Harry, and the film's original trailer, which is really stupid. I don't know why you would cut the trailer. It's not like it's very long, and it's not like you have actually restored the trailer as you should, but those are the unfortunate losses here, which means this UHD is not the complete comprehensive package of extras that it easily could have been. So if you want all the extras, you do have to hang on to the Blu-ray for those, and frankly, I would say you want the Blu-ray and maybe the Laserdisc as well if you want all the extras in their best quality, because Warner does not do that on their UHDs. They merely seem to take various old files and put them on the UHD and cause further problems by not making sure the legacy extras are transferred and included properly. So that is the Warner standalone UHD of Dirty Harry. It is a frustrating mixed bag of a release. I still have to recommend it because it has a form of the original mono that's solid, and it's the first release to have the original proper audio of the film in its original mono form since, about 1982, but it's the first version to have the mono in some form if you count the Laserdisc stereoized version, since that master was done in the early 90s. The Atmos remix is absolutely dire, and you should avoid it at all costs. The new extras are not worth the cost of admission, but at least there's something that could be called a new extra on here. But that also means they did drop some of the legacy extras, so you got to hang on to old releases, and there are some issues with the legacy extras, so you got to hang on to old releases. The new transfer, though, yes, it's giant leaps forward over what we've had before, but it's got giant problems that reflect the continual issues we see time and time again with Warner Studio UHDs. Even when they do these big, gigantic 4K, 6K, 8K scans of negatives of classic, iconic Crown Jewel Warner titles, and then they cut corners and do this stuff for no reason and produce bare bones or corner cutting or lackluster UHDs like this and still charge the price of what a boutique label might charge for a release with care put into it. None of this makes any sense, and unfortunately Dirty Harry, I think, is one of the most frustrating of the Warner UHDs because none of this had to be a thing. And worst of all, the inconsistencies in the transfer and then the terrible HDR and frozen grain problems with further inconsistencies show that even the restoration efforts apparently weren't up to snuff across the board, because none of this should be a thing. When you scan a negative, which I think this one was an 8K scan, and then you produce this as the final result, again, it makes you go, well, why'd you do this in the first place? You fixed issues in the Blu-ray's HD master, but you caused gigantic new issues. And, other people wouldn't have done that. Other people would have taken the time to get things right. They may not have gotten it 100%, but they would have at least tried. And this just reeks of not trying. But that's the classic Warner Studio label way. This is what we see time and time again. But this could have been a perfect release very easily, but that would require people who actually cared to get things right, and Warner doesn't do that. So again, I have to recommend this disc, but with major drawbacks and notes, and just go in knowing that you're going to be confronted by this stuff, because when these visual anomalies and defects and problems pop up, they're very obvious. And the Atmos remix, I think, is dire. But, if you insist on having a big multi-channel, overhead channel, modern Atmos sound field for a gritty, iconic, on-the-streets 1971 police thriller, I guess you'll feel you got your money's worth and what you wanted, but it's not what anyone intended. It is not Dirty Harry, it's the Atmos reversion of Dirty Harry, and then the HDR presentation is not Dirty Harry as it was made and released in 1971. It's the Warner HDR10 version of Dirty Harry with their Warner Atmos version of the sound of Dirty Harry. So you have to live with that as well. So I know that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but I found this disc extraordinarily frustrating. It's got all the usual Warner problems and hang-ups, but the severity level of them is far more than your typical corner-cutting, uncaring Warner standard release. So again, I have to recommend this, but know going in there's problems, and you'll want to hang on to past copies if you're a big fan of the film, or Don Siegel's work, or a big Clint Eastwood fan, because as is usual, Warner can't be bothered to get things right. So those are my thoughts on Dirty Harry, revisiting it on the Warner UHD. Unfortunately, it is what it is, and I don't think these problems will ever be addressed unless Warner allows it to be licensed out to one of the boutique labels that care. I know that Arrow Video has been doing more and more Warner licensing deals. I don't think a major title like Dirty Harry, especially with Clint Eastwood's rights interest in the film as well, I don't think that would ever get licensed out, but if it did, somebody like Arrow could at least try to address some of the issues in this master, but they'd be stuck dealing with the baked-in things like frozen grain and such. So this really should be redone from the ground up in order to get these things right, but Warner's not going to do that. They're just going to Warner more. So if you've seen the Dirty Harry UHD, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the transfer and presentation in the comments below. I think it's still essential for the upgrades and having the mono mix finally on a disc, but the headaches are so severe and completely unnecessary that it just really rubs it in that Warner doesn't care about getting things right. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films and their physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. As always, please do keep supporting studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc, even when they're screwy as heck for no reason, like these Warner UHDs continually are, and the Dirty Harry UHD is a particularly notable example of this, because when you buy a disc, even a screwy as heck one like this, you're still able to get some benefits and positives out of it. And with every disc you buy, you are supporting physical media survival, and you are supporting further films to get new scans and releases or restorations. So we just have to keep plugging away at this and supporting releases and studios, even when they don't care to do the job right that they're supposed to do, because that does at least ensure that we show the companies that film restoration is important to continue and maintain. And with the Warner buyout taking place, it's unknown where this stuff is going to go. So we do need to continue to support physical media to show our support financially to ensure that these processes do continue, even if Warner doesn't have a good history of getting everything to the finish line properly done. I hope you're watching, Warner, because I don't know what you call this exactly.
I certainly don't call it a restored UHD. I kind of feel like I got shot in the leg again.
And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.
You dropped the gun, creep! I'll blow his brains out! Drop the freaking review! I know what you're thinking. Did he fire 6 review shots or only 5? Well, to tell you the truth, in all this excitement, I kinda lost track myself. But being this is a dedicated reviewer, the most powerful inspection force in the world, and would blow your revisionist disc clean off, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk disc?